Hello, and welcome to the now second episode in a new webinar series by Construction Wave called The Financial Chair. The premise of the series is relatively simple. We speak to leading finance professionals and construction experts about a variety of topics relating specifically to money and the industry's relationship to it. My name is Rory Butler, editor of Construction Wave, and today I am joined by Rob Driscoll. Rob is Director of Legal and Business at industry trade body Electrical Contractors Association, or ECA. And today we're going to be discussing retention payments. Rob, welcome.
Hi.
So, Rob, before we get into retentions, perhaps you can give a brief overview of your career, ECA,
Okay.
and your role within the organisation.
I won't give you too much of a life story, but as a kid, I was the son of a contractor, so a mechanical and electrical contractor who traditionally sits at tiers 2 and 3, but they're in national level, and nephew, cousin, and all the rest of it, 2 electrical contractors. I actually ran away from the profession or the sector and didn't want to have anything to do with construction, so I obviously failed at that. It's my first admission. I went into law, became a solicitor. And then when I qualified, and you look around as you do as a brand new solicitor to what area you want to specialize in, it made sense to understand the conversation around the breakfast and dinner table. So that's why I ended up back in construction. Since then, I guess I spent the first part of my career in private practice, which is traditionally what people see lawyers as, clocking up hourly rates every 6 minutes. Then I left and I came into trade bodies. I've been in a couple now, and over those years, we run help desks for contractors, consultants at tiers 1, 2, 3, sometimes even 4. We look at the economic data, the political angles, and the wider macroeconomic picture as it moves forward. So we've become a little bit of a jack of all trades. But I think most importantly, 20 years into this world, we still do frontline firefighting as traditional lawyers, either be it looking after ECA's legal interests or the interests of its 2,500 to 3,000 members who operate both in construction and the facilities management maintenance space. So that's me.
Great. Just out of interest, do you think it was by design or serendipity that you ended up at the ECA, coming from a kind of an M&E start in life?
I don't, fortuitous or serendipitous maybe.
Yeah.
It wasn't by design. There were no nepotistic opportunities presented to me. If anything, it was the other way around. You'd live in the shadow of those that had gone before you, and you'd never quite carve your own niche or reputation. There is that crystallizing moment when somebody stops referring to you as so-and-so's son, brother, or nephew, and refers to them as your father, cousin, or uncle, which is quite nice. But yeah, apart from that, I don't think people give you a break for that kind of thing in this industry.
Okay, so you've outlined your background, your credentials nicely there.
Mm-hmm.
I think that leads us into our first question. And as I said at the outset, we're going to be talking about retentions, which huge topic for the industry. So let's jump straight in. And the first one, Rob, is a two-part question, really. The first is, I wonder if you can first of all speak to how retention payments came about, and as a second part, could you describe the payment landscape in the UK and why retentions still exist?
The first one's relatively easy. Retentions came about as part of the Industrial Revolution, back when they were building the railways, and be it masonry, stonework, or the railway system. The idea being that if you're employing multiple trades across multiple sectors, you would keep an amount of the price owed back as security against non-performance, and non-performance would include going insolvent. So you've got basically a wedge of money in the bank to offset against the cost of getting somebody else on to replace them. So it really dates back a long, long time. I think the question that arises thereafter, and I'll get to your second question in a second, is that they actually do what they were meant to do. And I would argue they don't. They do provide leverage, but they don't cover the costs that you're going to face. They don't necessarily motivate the contractors in the way they're meant to. The fair payment landscape is a wider topic. So everybody starts on a fair payment debate by looking at, for one silver bullet, what's the thing that's going to solve it all? Is it the Construction Act? Do we need to reform that? Do we need to put more interest on late payment? Do we need more codes, more charters? Do we need legislative reform on retentions? They're all relevant questions, and it's probably a combination of them all. But I think the one thing I've learned, and your listeners might be sitting here thinking, well, what's the solicitor got to do with this? We're on a finance podcast. We need to know about people that have some inclination about money. So going back to my background, I spent by and large 20 years trying to get people's money back, from my first ever experience in law of squatters, which was rent arrears, right through to my construction days. Because of whether it's a alleged failure of kit, or the design, or the install, or the maintenance, the first thing people do in terms of behaviour, I'm not paying until you fixed it. And usually I'm not paying all of it, not just the amount we're in dispute over, because it's their leverage to get paid or to get performance, hence the need for retentions. I think the other thing we have to understand is the nature of the history of our industry, and that was something that did come through the kind of the family knowledge, if you like. I remember it being described to me that in 1979 and 1985 or thereabouts, the interest rate in the UK was 15.5 up to 17%. You could argue, if you're an economist, and I'm not, but I've just got a keen interest in this area, take a 60, 70-year view of interest rates in UK economics. Our propensity to borrow has gone up 2/3 compared to what it was. Our interest rate since 2010 financial crash, following quantitative easing, has been kept artificially low. We had the inflation rates out today. It's not quite going down to where Bank of England wants it to be. So there's no more rate cuts at the moment. You can argue that's just returning to a normal level of lending fees in terms of interest rates in pre-financial crash, as opposed to what we've had since. But we've had a whole generation that has free borrowing since 2010. So I think that's why we find it slightly outrageous as consumers. What relevance has that got? Well, number one, it was taught to me that that's why you could make more money at tiers 1, 2, and 3 on potentially over-applying upstream, underpaying downstream, and trading on that money overnight on overseas markets, etc., than you could ever constructing anything. Over those generations, because we're talking about the 60s, 70s and beyond till now, you've seen an industry that has an average profit margin of 2.5%. The retentions is usually 3% or 5%. I have seen contracts where it's 10%. Obviously, we've got rid of that and gone with the industry norm. But it kind of tells you something when the amount being kept back as the deposit against non-performance is higher than the profit margin in the job.
Yeah.
And when you look at a contractor's business model, because they are my audience, they largely consist of second-hand fleet, sheds, including offices and workshops, tools, computers, etc. The lion's share of their value as a corporate entity is in their work in progress. Contracts which will fall away usually automatically or on election, where an insolvency event occurs. So I think that's the precarious nature of construction as a sector, which is why it kind of tends to historically rank third highest in the charts for insolvencies. We'll come back and answer your fair payment question in a second. I think the other thing you need to understand about the landscape, and I'm using what's now the Department of Business and Trade, but was Business, Energy, Industrial Strategy at the time when they released these reports in 2013. Industry average project delivery supply chains are 4 to 5 levels deep and 70 packages wide. So the base of the pyramid is extremely wide, and therefore the precarious nature of each level as they go down is even more fragile. They call it disaggregation and fragmentation. Again, you could argue we need a percentage of insolvency within the industry for the rest of the industry to survive because it's that cannibalistic. So you then turn to what's fair payment landscape. You've got a bunch of initiatives out there. You've got a code. It used to be the Prompt Payment Code late last year, rebranded into the Fair Payment Code, made slightly more complex. There's nothing wrong with codes and charters. They are political flags around which signatories can coalesce and prove their ethical and moral standing to market players. Nothing wrong with that. I'm not hugely impressed with the complexities they've added to the current code, but it doesn't mean it's bound to failure. We have some law out there, like you must have interest on late payment. Statutory default is 8%, but you can agree some other rate so long as it's a substantial remedy. So people usually go down to 5. Go lower than that could be a problem because it might not be substantial. You've got payment reporting obligations on those who fit the definition of large firms to report on their payment performance. They were reporting on the speed they took 0 to 30, 30 to 60, 60 plus days on invoices or applications in our language of construction. Now they have to report on the value on those invoices as well, because you could drown large supply chain invoices or applications with Costa Coffee and Uber receipts if you wanted to cheat the system. You're also going to start having to report on retentions, how much you keep on people.
Yep.
So we've added to that too. I should have said at the start that part of my role until March was spending over a decade helping Cabinet Office shape these policies.
Okay.
So the fair payment landscape is a combination of law, policy, and using the public sector purse, which accounts for 35% of the demand in our industry, to leverage a pull effect, i.e. you're not going to win work unless you exceed these expectations around fair payment, prompt payment. But in my experience, contractors who are the deliverers just want to be paid on time. They don't want to be paid early. They just want to be paid on time. The other problem they get is they might be paid on time, but are they being undervalued? But that's a difficult debate because others would say, well, they've overapplied. Does that help?
Yeah, lots of questions coming from that. I suppose I just want to come back to your focusing on insolvency. I think, generally speaking, we all accept that the balance of retention payments tends to skew towards the paying client. But I'm just curious, in your opinion, who else, because of how complex this the structure of this is currently, who else tends to benefit from retention payments continuing in its current form? You know, is it just the paying clients, or is it external entities, you know, second and third and fourth degree partners? And also what sorts of, I wondered if you can also to kind of talk about, to contextualize this, what sort of sums of money are we typically talking about? I've seen, you know, 5% of the sector's overall annual turnover going toward the cost of retention payments.
There are some clients out there, I'm not going to deny it, some really innovative, groundbreaking clients who, with such a long pipeline of work, I think it was National Rail, abandoned retentions a while back. But prevalent they are across most of the industry still. I guess, what does it do for people's, in practical terms? If I'm the payer and I'm holding retention across all my packages that I'm subletting, and I outsource on average, I'm using averages again from government reports, 80% of my package as a tier 1, then I'm keeping back 5% of everything I'm paying. So actually it's making my working capital look good.
Yeah.
I don't argue that there's something wrong, by the way, with the need to have security against non-performance.
Mm-hmm.
I'd argue there's something wrong with the way we're administering it. That's my personal opinion, is it's not secure. So let's do a comparison, for example, between a bond, a performance or bond in one sense. You go to the market, can go to a bank or an insurer performance bond. Banks usually take it off your lending facility, so we tend to go to insurers in the UK market. You can have an on default or an on demand. UK doesn't tend to have on demand bonds because they act as secondary discounts, because you don't have to prove your loss before you make a claim on it. So
Right.
UK tends to stick with on default performance bonds, where the system is that the independent insurer can get approached by the beneficiary. And the beneficiary can say, this contractor has not performed, either defects or insolvency or whatever else. We want to make a claim. And the insurer will say, prove it. So long as they sufficiently prove it, they can draw down on the facility.
Mm-hmm.
By way of contrast, retentions. Beneficiary keeps the money in their pocket, holds on to it and says, I'm going to make a claim on them. Contrary to English law, where you've got to prove your claim, I've got a claim against your money. Your money's in my pocket with all the rest of my money.
Mm-hmm.
If you think I'm wrong, prove it. Take me to
Right.
court, enjoy the legal fees and the duration and the resources it takes. First thing any lawyer like me will say is, how much are you owed? How desperate are you for it? Can you afford to fight? Are you going to bite the hand that feeds you in terms of the client and the other work they give you? Because usually clients are strategic partners. If it's not worth the legal fees, going to roll over and take a deal. So there are vast sums of retention monies that go wrong because the custodian or the payer has an inherent conflict of interest. And that's my point. If I'm holding the cash in my pocket with all of my other monies, I've got a conflict of interest because I'm both guardian or custodian of that cash and claimant on it. And there's no separation of those functions in the same way there would be if it was performance bond. So that's where the scope for abuse comes up.
Mm-hmm. Just so I'm clear, if we can just make that last sort of point crystal clear, both for myself and listeners also. You're saying that, if I'm not mistaken, that the onus is actually on not the paying client, but on the contractor to prove that they are owed retention money.
Yeah,
and,
well,
and sorry, and in the meantime, the paying party, the client, if you like, can declare that money as working capital while sort of off-gassing the risk to smaller firms, as it were.
In the old days, in the older standard form contracts of the late 1990s, there used to be a clause in them, or in some of them, which certainly said that the payer must identify the retention monies and hold it in an independent account, and held it as a fiduciary trustee. So I held it on behalf of the payee. And if I'm the payer and you're the payee, so I'm ring fencing it and I'm holding it to the side, identified as yours. So
Right.
if I went down and went bust, it wouldn't go with me because that's identified as your money. The problem, since that clause has disappeared because most people deleted it, is I don't have to do that. I can hold it within my own monies, all along with the rest of my cash. It's not identifiable. So the basis of UK insolvency law is if I go bust, because you can't identify which monies in my account are yours, you can't claim on them.
Right.
The other point that I was making about the law is if you take me to court, it is your duty to prove your claim before the burden shifts to me to disprove your claim. Whereas if you are the payee, if you are the person holding the retentions, and you now feel that I have defects in my works, you don't really need to prove those defects. You just need to issue a pay less notice under the Construction Act, telling me I'm not going to get paid, and identifying the maths, because it only asks for the basic calculation in the amount due. That's what the statute says. And then it's left to me to say, hang on a minute, I don't think your alleged defects are real. So I've got to go on the offense, take you to court and disprove a claim you haven't yet proved. So that's the kind of inherent reversal of the burden of proof.
Yeah, I understand.
Now, actually, you might have a point. I might have committed defects, but whilst you haven't even proved it or given me any evidence of it, I have no idea. I could go back and remediate those and fix them for you without this being a particularly cash-orientated issue.
I want to come to how this impacts on insolvencies and in both cases, like from the contractor perspective and the client perspective. But I just want to linger on this just for a second longer. You must see a lot of these types of cases, and I'm just wondering, what is the kind of best and worst case you've seen in terms of how long and how costly a retention payment dispute could potentially become?
Let's roll some rules of thumb out there. So let you into some secrets, I guess, from behind the A&E lawyers triaging this type of call. Somebody rings up and says they're owed money. The first thing was, how much? Have you got a contract? What does it say? What are your rights to payment? If you have clarity around that, you have a much stronger position to argue your case from. Financially, if it's below 10K, you can take it to the small claims courts yourself. You can represent yourself quite easily. They will ask you to go through a mediation system. If you lost, you wouldn't be free, but your costs would be limited in terms of what you'd have to pay out the other side, as well as obviously not recovering the retention. Anything above 10K, you could end up in the fast and the multi-track of the court system. That could take 9 months at least. It could take years. You will also need solicitors and barristers. Some of my private practice colleagues reckon that we'd be 300 or 400 quid an hour these days. I have no idea. It's been a long time. But imagine when you ask some of the pedigree construction law firms, in broad terms, what would they get out of bed for? They have said, well, it's not worth us touching disputes under 100K. That means you've got a black hole. Above 10K, below 100. And this is just broad brush rules of thumb, because there are cheaper consultants and lawyers out there, where you've got a serious problem of your debt not being viable to take to means of recovery. And some of your listeners will say, well, what about adjudication? That has become increasingly more legal and needing representation, again, solicitors and barristers or quantity surveyor consultants, which can be equally as expensive. So you've still got the when is it cost prohibitive question that hangs in the air to recover it. You then got practical issues where you're looking at something and people have come up with either alleged delays or the kit's failed, it wasn't installed properly, which they may have to evidence once you've taken action against them, but not before. Meanwhile, they're holding on to your 30, 40, 50K, and you're going to go and spend 30, 40, 50K at least on somebody chasing it.
Yeah.
Just the commercial pressures. They can be significant chunks of money, and you lose that on a repeat basis on a rolling contract system with multiple clients, and that's where you're seeing the push towards insolvencies. I think the insolvency rate that we've seen, which I said has jumped by around 20%, I think, since pre-COVID activity, it's ameliorated slightly over the last 12 to 18 months, slightly down, but it's still high.
Yeah.
Now, I think that's because we've had the withdrawal of COVID support, the Russia-Ukraine crisis, which has caused above 23% inflation in my world, in mechanical electrical, and you've got fixed price contracts that go over a 12 to 18 month period. So you were holding your price in 23 for practically 18 months in a period of extreme volatility where the market was going exponentially up. That caused rampant insolvencies. The bond market restricted. People weren't willing to lend cash. and then people start to fall over because behaviour hardens. We've seen some of this data before. Post-financial crash, bank lending across the economy dipped by 5%. In construction, it dipped by 38%. Payment periods trebled because that was cheaper, borrowing money by paying your supply chain late or delaying it, than it was to borrow money from the finance market. So the behaviours aren't new.
Let's linger on insolvency now that we're here. You've quite nicely taken us into the area, and you've begun to describe the insolvency landscape, particular to construction, and some of the macroeconomic factors at play here. And you're right that post COVID, it's the number of insolvencies has gone up, although as you observe in the last sort of 12 to 18 months, it's been less severe, although it's still the highest. Construction is still the highest sector in the UK for insolvency. Can you say a bit more about the role of retention payments specifically in the rise of contractor insolvency in the UK, particularly among SMEs who are, as you described, and as we all know, cash flow dependent?
So if you look down that 3 to 4 level supply chain, when you get to 3 and 4, they're the people actually on the site doing the work. Everybody else above it is either using their technical expertise or management skills to coordinate and manage the construction process. But even in the M&E world, you will then subdivide into pipe fitters and refrigeration, air conditioning, and electrical, it could be fire and security or audio visual, those kinds of specific trades. They're the ones living hand to mouth, getting materials from one place, labour from another place. Their labour will walk off if it's not paid at the end of the week. So they have a sandwich pressure effect in the middle. And material suppliers will watch the credit reports and simply shut down your Amazon-style account in terms of turning up at the wholesaler and ordering stuff if you've not paid your bills. It's a much easier business model for supplying products than it is being a contractor. I guess if you are withholding an average 5% retentions, that might be seen as quite a nice slush fund to fund the replacement of a contractor that's gone bust or gone into an insolvency. My question is, does it? Does it touch the sides on the loss you're going to experience if you're the payer? Or is it 5, 3, 2 times that sum at least? So it doesn't really help you. I know there are other methods of security like parent company guarantees. Most SMEs don't have parents. Or performance bonds. The bond market's constricted so much, you probably can't get those at the moment. So it's not really going to do much for you. When you look at it from the payee's perspective, often they will sometimes factor in the loss of retentions because they're so used to being abused over it. They priced it into the job. They've certainly priced late payment and credit control into the job, otherwise they still wouldn't be around. So does it act as leverage to force them to come back and remediate defects if it's not an insolvency event and it's purely non-performances of another kind? Not always. Have we done the right thing in the first place if we tendered the job and awarded it to the person with the lowest price, even though they were so financially precarious? We've got to, I'm going to be slightly dramatic here, commercially asphyxiate them by putting retentions on top. Which is why earlier I said some of the more innovative people who have chosen to move away from it have said, we've got a pipeline of work, we've got other ways of securing performance. People that don't perform or aren't robust enough for us, we don't hire in the first place, and they fail at our pre-qualification system. Then they've looked at quality as opposed to purely almost like antiquated financial pecuniary processes, which act more as punishment than anything. I'm not saying there isn't a place, as I said at the start, some people might advocate the eradication of retentions. I believe there's merit in both solutions, but personally right now, I'm in favour of probably protection because I think it's probably the most realistic prospect in terms of what reform might look like.
Okay, so that takes us quite nicely into my next question. And now, soon we're going to sort of talk about some examples of
Hmm.
successful initiatives and what that might look for in terms of reform here. But just realistically, what sort of appetite for reform is there with so much money at stake, on both sides, and potentially
Hmm.
huge losses to clients as more firms go under as well. So they're
Yeah,
trying to insulate themselves.
they're insulating themselves, but maybe their insulation is one of the reasons why they're going under.
Yeah,
Is the other side of it. So you've got arguments on both sides of the coin,
yeah,
and we've got to appreciate both sides. Clients don't want defective buildings. So there are two avenues to reform. There is one camp emerging saying, let's abolish retentions by law. My issue with that is, well, the clients are surely going to sit and say, we will do once you stop building defective buildings, which is surely a legitimate argument. My other point about that is a very practical one. Having worked in private practice law with some of the top city law firms, it would be an intellectual blood sport to throw an amount of money at some of the firms and say, here's the legislative abolition as enshrined in this new statute, find a way around it and create retentions by another means. So would it just emerge later via another system in the first place? So for those that want it, just remove it from the supply chain and make it protected from both payee and payer insolvency risk, which is the other camp for reform. So in 2018, there was a government consultation on reform of retentions. Loads of people responded to it. The vast majority of the respondents advocated reform of some kind. Nazim Zahar, I think it was at the time, came back with the consultation response was inconclusive because industry could not reconcile what type of reform was required. So there was no intervention at the time. I think now we're in a place where that has shifted. You asked me about the macroeconomics. This cash is also taken out the wrong place because remember, the baseline here is the retentions is cash that's already been delivered on site to the project in terms of people and materials.
yeah,
So it's amounts kept back as a percentage from stuff that's already been done,
yeah.
not future. So in one sense, it is therefore the payee's cash, which they would otherwise use because it's the SME fraternity that's therefore forward funding the project for education, apprentices, investment, moving towards better building information modeling or off-site manufacturing, MMC, all those other wonderful things that as an industry we agree we can't do quick enough or invest more in to move us on in terms of our evolutionary journey. But if we've still got this industrial revolution, antiquated way of securing performance, there must be a better way of doing it. I'd also argue here that there's two ways of reforming it. One is you follow what's happened in New South Wales, where they introduced a requirement to hold retentions in trust over a certain contract value because they had a double Carillion system. It happened to them in one single year. You've got Western Australia has gone with something similar, but without the contract value threshold. And you've got the best example at the moment is October 23. New Zealand moved their goalposts because their legislative protection, their version of the Construction Act was deficient. They said prior to 2023, you can commingle the monies that are retentions in your working capital, but if you do go bust, they won't go with you. So they were still identifiable in the way I described earlier. They weren't. Didn't happen. People still went bust. They took all the cash with them. When on a black and white reading of the law, it didn't work, so they changed it. And they looked at abolition and said, yeah, we did look at it for about 5 minutes, but that didn't fly with us. We also decided there was just as much chance of payers and payees going bust at the moment. What have we had? ISG, Buckingham, others, that have all gone bust in the last couple of years, demonstrating that point. So they now have a system where if the payer wants to keep the cash, they have to replace it with a retention bond in favour of the payee, usually the contractor or subcontractor waiting for their retentions. Otherwise, they've got to keep it in a protected bank account with their name on it and do the admin behind it. The question has arisen, well, can you get these bonds? Yes, because the legislation has prescribed it. The insurers have stepped up and started to provide them. There will be some teething issues around it, but by and large, it's settling down nicely. But one of the ironic effects is because you can't hold on to that cash as part of your own working capital, is it worth administering the retentions at all? Because you're not benefiting from sitting on that cash in your own account. And so some people are just moving away from retentions anyway. So that's part of it. And I guess the third item that I describe around this is some of this is also about transparency. And what you've seen in my lifetime and what I was partly instrumental in trying to steer was the evolution of digital apps and platforms that would bring transparency to payment in construction. Because as a blind lawyer who came into the industry, as I said earlier, quite young, I looked at the Construction Act, which my colleagues at the time were quite involved in designing, and thought, why have we got this Amazon arrangement of 5 dates where you've got a application, due date, payment notice date, pay less notice date, and final date where you actually receive cash? And it's not automated. The same way when I put an order in on Amazon, I get order placed, order dispatched, order delivered somewhere in your garden. And you know that your expectations are managed. Or if they're not going to be managed because it's not there on the right day, you can do something about it, which is the same thing for payment. If you're not going to get everything you're owed, you could do something about it. So I think that's key as well, lifting the lid on transparency of where you are in the payment process by some of these platforms, and the retentions will be key to resolving some of these issues.
So transparency, bonds potentially, and almost like a trust that functions a little bit like a deposit retention scheme or something like that for property, where it's automatically released.
That was the analogy that was around a couple of years back. I think technology has moved on, whereas the tenancy deposit schemes was a little bit analog. Things could be a little bit more automated now. So things the sums of money did just drop down. And I think that's where New Zealand's ahead of us. Okay.
Just a slight tangent, Rob, if that's okay. You mentioned 2018. I'm just wondering, was Carillion the inflection point for that, reform action that kind of just fizzled out? And why does it, if that's the case, why is it always these big events that spur people to do something and then it quickly dies out?
I think the big events one's probably the easiest to answer. Political analyst once said to me, you always need a Piper Alpha. Construction has had a humanity disaster in terms of Grenfell and a corporate disaster in terms of Carillion that lifted the lid. I remember being asked by the Secretary of State at the time of the Carillion collapse, what is it that went wrong? My response was, we all knew we had the alcoholic uncle in the family, but no one spoke about it. In that sense, they were borrowing 120 days payments from their 3,000 suppliers. So they were borrowing liquidity back into their business. So it wasn't really a surprise that eventually it would fall over. So are these events are disasters, especially in immediate terms, as we saw with ISG for the supply chain. And some of my clients were implicated in as primary and secondary creditors of that one. However, I guess capitalizing on the political side, they do demonstrate the need to move on. Maybe when the focus has shifted elsewhere and you are in a competing landscape of global disasters, wars, and other things that need reform and attention. So it doesn't surprise me in that sense. But no, 2018, they were launching the conversation anyway. It just happened to coincide with Carillion's collapse, and Carillion demonstrated the theory of why retentions was bad in the first place, because it took so many suppliers with it.
As you said earlier on in this conversation, you're actually helping and have been helping to shape government policy making around retention reform in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
And while it currently isn't possible to talk specifics about that, are you able to talk about what sort of timeline should contractors expect for reform? Because there's lots of stages before legislative amendments actually become ratified, going through the houses. And how are you driving that forward in sort of practical terms? What could it look like?
Well, I guess my engagement with the Cabinet Office, which is the client side of government, finished in March, quite healthily, by the way. I don't determine the policy. I just was engaged to give ideas, and I didn't receive any money for it either, so it wasn't a pecuniary role. Whether those ideas fly, get shaped, watered down, I don't necessarily know, but I would like to think that there are certain initiatives that have had my ideas and shaping along with others. In terms of timeline, it wouldn't be a surprise to me that with every new government or new minister, every now and again they do a late payment consultation of some kind. I remember responding to the Kelly Tolhurst one or anything like that. So at some point we'll probably see something come out from government, whether it's on all late payments and or construction, I won't know yet. One would hope that given the change of political persuasion of government and the rhetoric around going further faster, fairness, the ambitions in terms of their missions to go to net zero, build homes, they will recognise the arguments that if you want the capacity and the capability in our industry to deliver, you've got to intervene and do something about the cash side to reconcile the unfair impact of retentions on SMEs. So one of my other roles is to engage through the Construction Leadership Council, but there are many people that do. I would certainly, if we are, as and when there is a consultation, be submitting a reasoned arguments, some of which I've rehearsed here today, as to how government could use innovative ideas and borrow models from other jurisdictions in order to reconcile this and safeguard that cash so it's not lost from the industry, but maintain the leverage where necessary and to ensure clients get what they need too.
And just so we're clear, sorry, go on.
Yeah, okay.
Just so we're clear, would this fall within the purview of the construction retention abolition bill, I think it is, or is that just a kind of placeholder for now, do you think?
So previously there have been private members' bills. You're talking, or you're referring to some of the previous ones there. One was launched by Peter Aldous some time ago, just after Carillion actually. And it was my team with other people who got, I think it was around 320 parliamentary signatories to support that bill. The issue with private members' bills is they can be a bit of a PR stunt to bring pressure to bear. They may need to get selected from the ballot. They need to then get a first reading, second reading to get anywhere. There are instances where they have become law, but they don't tend to make it. They tend to fall before they've made the statute book. But those bills, nevertheless, maintain momentum and maintain the arguments that this area needs reform. I go back to the 2018 consultation. The resounding response was, we need reform. It was just convenient at the time that there wasn't agreement over the form of reform. And maybe what industry should do as a consequence, next time it's asked, is coalesce around one solution so that we can take ourselves forward. But I think it is clear that things like we used to have a construction supply chain payment charter some years ago. We've had a retentions roadmap. We haven't been able to resolve this issue ourselves as an industry. often government has historically looked for industry to solve its own issues. That's right as an approach, and it quite often does happen when it comes to standards, safety, education. It very rarely happens when it comes to issues of cash because they are so divisive.
Yeah. Just in these last few minutes, Rob, just want to really draw on your expertise as a lawyer. You occupy a unique position, both inward, inward and outward on this issue. What advice do you think you can reasonably give to contractors, both main and supply chain businesses, in sort of negotiating, and I mean deciphering in a way, not actual negotiations, but deciphering retention payments when agreeing contract terms? And I'm thinking about like the rationale for retentions expressed in contracts, or grappling with ill-defined terms. What should they be thinking there, and what recourse is available?
So we do training to our community that are already members of our trade body. They often ask me the question, where do you start with the contract, Rob? And I'll say, because of JCT being the predominant standard form for around 70% of what we see, I will turn around and say, start at section 4, payment, then read backwards. There are other sections beyond that about termination, insurance, etc. But that will tell you your cash flow exposure. Because in broad terms, tier 1, tier 2, whatever you are paid in arrears as you go until completion. So you are forward funding the build process. As those materials and labour become part of the land, regardless of clauses of contracts, retention of title clauses, you lose ownership. So it's a funny business model. It's a fragile one, because it's like the client comes into your shop, buys your goods, takes them away, consumes them, and then redecides how much it's willing to pay you, even though it agreed the price in the first place. You don't get that in any other sector. So let's go to section 4. For subcontractors, we tend to say, remember the Construction Act does say retentions cannot be pay when certified, i.e. you'll get yours when the main contract, PC, practical completion certificate or handover certificate happens, or when the making good of defects certificate under that other contract happens. It's not allowed under the Construction Act. You still see plenty of instances of that drafting. For us in M&E, where we tend to work on our first fix, second fix, and we're done on site basis, why would we agree to our retentions being held for 12, 18 months after PC of the main works anyway? Because that's a landscape gardener who's going to hold that one up. It's got nothing to do with us. The other side, I guess, to it is check the clauses. Try and reinstate that money must be held independently, so that if there is an event of insolvency, it doesn't go down. On a practical level, maybe use the technology that's out there. There are defects correction or rectification software platforms that will allow you to list, monitor, manage, and evidence defects. If that plugged into the payment app systems as well, you'd start to get real integration, because payment would link in to that evidence bank. This goes for the tier 1s as well as the tier 2s. You could see why there were claims building up against your retentions. You could examine the evidence. You might turn out that it's the mechanical, not the electrical, and therefore those defects shouldn't be against your retentions account, it could be against someone else's. And you could avoid some of these disputes and avoid people like me as lawyers. For the tier 1s, I think it's slightly more precarious. Tier 2s as well. You're trying to manage your upstream and your downstream liability. So you're obviously trying to agree the same rate, but you do have to realise, particularly since things like the Procurement Act come in with 30-day payment on public sector works as mandatory, can't contract out, that you have an obligation downstream to pay people. So I guess there, again, be on top of your retentions, look at any contra charges and claims coming, try to resolve them proactively rather than having a scrap through adjudication or litigation. Because by the time it gets to people like me, and this is why I learnt the lessons, and I don't have the vested interest of hourly rates of traditional lawyers, is we are not adding value to the project unless we're at the contractual stage. At the dispute stage, we're about to ruin relationships forever.
Right.
We're not productive. We are a crisis tool, which you don't really want to get out, because the other party will go and get their crisis tool out as well and take you to entrenched positions. So I get back to where I started, which is, I guess the family background taught me to focus on the project and the delivery of it. Does that help?
Absolutely. Thank you. Rob Driscoll, Director of Legal and Business at Electrical Contractors Association. Thanks for being a guest on the Construction Wave Financial Chair Series. Much appreciated.
Thanks for the opportunity.
We'll be watching your activities, Rob, and that of retention payments in the coming weeks and months, and wish you lots of luck for the future. Our next guest on the Financial Chair Series will be announced shortly, but we are looking forward to getting into the weeds of mergers and acquisitions next with a leading contractor and its financial partner in our next session. So please keep an eye out for that. It's coming out very soon. Thank you for today, Rob. Really educational and valuable, I think. And hope to speak to you again very soon.
Thank you. Cheers.